The name was already there when Celia Cooper rode into Dusthaven. She did not know it yet. She did not know because nobody warned her, because nobody in this sun-bleached town of crooked boardwalks and whiskey-soaked secrets thought it worth mentioning that a drifter had pressed a knife into the old ridge post at the edge of town and carved her name into the weathered pine before he ever laid eyes on her face, before he heard her voice, before he knew anything about her except the one thing that had driven him across 400 miles of open desert and broken mountain trail to find her. She found out the way all terrible, beautiful truths find you in the Wild West, suddenly, without mercy, in front of witnesses. It was old Hattie Drummond who said it first, loud enough for the three men loafing outside the general store to hear every syllable. Hattie had a mouth like a rusted hinge and a memory sharp as a branding iron, and she pointed one gnarled finger at the ridge post and said, "Child, your name's been on that post since Tuesday, and Tuesday was 2 days before you arrived. You want to tell me how a man carves a name he doesn't know yet?" Celia pulled her horse to a stop. She was 24 years old, dark-haired and fierce-eyed, with the particular kind of exhaustion that comes from grief carried too long without a proper place to set it down. She had ridden from Abilene with a single carpetbag and a secret of her own that she had not yet decided what to do with. She had come to Dusthaven, Colorado, in the autumn of 1878 because her late father's will had named her the inheritor of a small parcel of land near Copper Ridge, and she had come alone because there was no one left to come with her. She stared at the post. Her name was unmistakable. The letters were deep, deliberate, and almost gentle in their precision. Celia Cooper, not a first name alone, the way you'd carve a lover's memory. Both names. Full and certain, as if the man who made those cuts already knew everything about her and had simply needed to announce it to the wood before he announced it to the world. Her blood went cold. "Who did this?" she said. It was not a question. It was the kind of statement a woman makes when she already suspects the answer might unravel something she is not ready to face. Hattie pointed down the main street toward the saloon, and Celia felt the cold deepen into something that sat right behind her sternum and refused to move. She had seen the man once before, 3 years ago, in a courthouse in Abilene, on the worst day of her life. His name was Calvin Carson, and he was the man who had testified against her father. She had come to Dusthaven expecting land, solitude, and the slow work of rebuilding. What she had not expected, what nobody had warned her about, was that Calvin Carson had arrived first, and that whatever force had driven him here had apparently known her name before she ever spoke it aloud in this town. She did not go to the saloon that afternoon. She went instead to the land office, where a narrow man named Mr. Piercy confirmed that her father, Harold Cooper, had indeed left her 620 acres in the foothills north of Copper Ridge, including a small stone house and a working spring. The deed was in order, the land was hers, but when she asked about recent newcomers, Piercy looked at the ceiling in that particular way people look when they are deciding how much of a truth to hand over. "Fella came in about 4 days back," Piercy said finally. "Calvin Carson, registered an intent to file a claim on a parcel south of yours. The two properties share a fence line as it happens, maybe 200 yards of shared boundary up on the East Ridge. The East Ridge, where the post stood." Celia thanked him with a voice that gave away nothing, and walked out into the copper-colored afternoon light, with her heart hammering in a way that made rational thought difficult. She had spent 3 years hating Calvin Carson with the clean, uncomplicated fury of a woman who needed something to hate because the alternative was to collapse entirely. Her father had been accused of rustling cattle from the Hanford Ranch, a charge that Celia had always believed to be manufactured, a fabrication designed to strip a struggling man of land and dignity. Calvin Carson had ridden into the Abilene courthouse and told the jury in a calm, steady voice that he had personally witnessed Harold Cooper driving 3 head of Hanford cattle across a cut fence. Harold Cooper had been fined everything he had. He had died 8 months later of a winter illness that Celia believed was really a broken heart wearing the mask of pneumonia. She had one question she had carried for 3 years. Only one. Why? Why had Calvin Carson, a man her father had apparently never mentioned and never known, arrived in that courtroom with testimony so precise and so devastating? What had he been paid? What had he been promised? Who had sent him? She had never had the chance to ask because he had disappeared after the trial, the way drifters do, folding himself back into the vast anonymous distances of the frontier. And now he was here, in Dusthaven, with her name carved into a ridge post before she had even arrived. The betrayal of it sat in her chest like a coal. She checked into Mrs. Yarrow's boarding house, which was a 2-story building that smelled of beeswax and dried lavender, and the kind of order that only a woman who had survived considerable disorder could produce. Mrs. Yarrow was 60, stout, and entirely uninterested in gossip, which Celia found immediately comforting. "The Carson man," Celia said carefully over supper that first evening, while Mrs. Yarrow set down a plate of roasted quail and cornbread. "Is he boarding here as well?" "No," Mrs. Yarrow said. "He is sleeping rough out at his claim site. He comes in for meals at the Blue Star Saloon and supplies at Harlan's store." To himself mostly, polite enough when spoken to, she paused and then added in a tone that was neither warm nor cold but simply factual, "He asked me if I knew when you were arriving." Celia set down her fork. "He asked you that?" "He did, about 3 days ago. Said he had business with a Celia Cooper coming up from Abilene." Mrs. Yarrow looked at her steadily. "I told him I didn't involve myself in other people's arrangements. I'm telling you now because I think you have a right to know." Celia stared at the candle flame for a long moment. Business. He had called it business. And yet he had carved her name into a post on a ridge that bordered the land her father had left her, as if staking some emotional claim that preceded any legal one. It did not add up. And the things that did not add up in the Wild West were generally either very dangerous or very important, and occasionally both. She slept poorly that night. In the morning she rose before dawn, dressed in her practical dark wool skirt and the sturdy boots she had bought in Abilene specifically for rough terrain, and she rode north out of Dusthaven toward Copper Ridge with a lantern and the intention of seeing her land before she saw the man who bordered it. The stone house her father had apparently purchased some years before his trouble was small, solid, and unexpectedly lovely in the early morning light. It had 2 rooms and a fireplace and a window that looked northeast toward the ridge where the pines grew in close, dark rows. The spring ran clear. The fence was intact on 3 sides. The east side, the side that shared a line with the Carson claim, had a gate in it, and the gate had been oiled recently. The hinge gleamed. She was standing at the gate when she heard the horse. She turned and found herself looking at Calvin Carson for the first time in 3 years, and the shock of it was physical. He was taller than she remembered, or perhaps it was simply that a courthouse had made him seem smaller than open country did. He was 30 years old, dark-eyed, with the particular lean quality of a man who spent more time moving than staying still. His clothes were well worn but clean. He held his hat in his hands. He stopped his horse 20 feet from her and did not get down. They looked at each other across 3 years of accumulated silence and the question of her father and the carved wood of the ridge post, and neither of them spoke for a long moment that felt like it had weight and temperature. "Miss Cooper," he said finally. His voice was exactly as she remembered it. Low, careful, and carrying none of the apology she had decided he owed her. "Mr. Carson," she said, "you carved my name into that post." He did not deny it. He did not look away either. "I did, before you ever spoke to me." "Yes." "You want to tell me why," she said, and this time it was a question because she had learned something in 3 years of grief, that demanding answers never worked as well as asking for them. He looked at her for a long moment, and something moved behind his eyes that she could not yet name. It was not guilt exactly. It was not arrogance. It was something older and more complicated, and it frightened her more than either of those things would have. "Not here," he said. "Not like this. You just arrived and you're already angry, which is fair, but I'd rather you hear what I have to say when you're not standing with the wind at your back and a gate between us." "I've been angry for 3 years," Celia said. "I do not intend to stop on your schedule." The corner of his mouth did something that was not quite a smile. "I wouldn't ask you to." He put his hat back on, wheeled his horse, and rode back toward the line of pines without another word, and Celia stood at the gate and watched him go with the entirely irrational sensation that she had just lost something by letting him leave. She spent that day and the next exploring her land and beginning the list of repairs the stone house needed. The roof was sound, which was the most important thing. The floor wanted sweeping, and the fireplace needed a new grate, which she could order from Harlan's store. There was a small barn attached to the east wall that could shelter 2 horses comfortably, and she set about cleaning it with the focused determination of a woman who understood that physical work was the only reliable cure for psychological distress. On the 3rd day, she rode into Dusthaven for supplies and found Calvin Carson at the counter of Harlan's store, ordering a coil of fencing wire and a box of carpenter's nails. He stepped aside to make room for her without being asked, and when she had finished her own order she found him waiting outside with his horse, not blocking her way, simply standing in the shade of the overhang in a way that suggested patience rather than pressure. "I'll buy you a coffee at the Blue Star," he said when she came out. "If you'll let me talk." She considered refusing. She considered it seriously, weighed it, examined it, and set it aside. The truth was that the carved name would not stop being carved. The truth was that she could not farm her land indefinitely with a question that large living on the east fence line. "One coffee," she said. The Blue Star Saloon was quieter in the morning than it would be by evening. A woman named Ada ran the kitchen attached to it and produced a coffee that was genuinely good, which was something of a miracle in Colorado in 1878. They sat at a table near the window, not across from each other exactly, more angled, the way people sit when they are not sure yet whether they are facing each other or facing the same problem from different directions. Calvin put his hands on the table, both of them flat, and Celia noted the calluses and the 2 old scars across his left knuckles and the fact that he wore no ring. "Your father did not steal those cattle," he said. The coffee cup stopped halfway to her mouth. "I know that," she said carefully. "I have always known that. Then you also know that the testimony I gave was not true." The word landed between them like a stone dropped into still water. "I know it felt wrong," she said, and she heard how controlled her voice was, how tightly she was holding the fury that had just redoubled. "I know my father was a good man. I know he never rustled a cow in his life. But I could not prove you were lying." "I was," Calvin said flatly, "and I need you to understand something before you decide to hate me for it for the rest of your life. I was given a choice that was not a choice. I was told that if I did not testify to what Randall Hanford wanted me to testify to, my younger sister would be hurt. She was 18 years old and she was working as a seamstress in Abilene, and Hanford had men who were happy to do his errands. I had no money for lawyers. I had no influence. I had nothing except a sister I would do anything to protect, and a conscience I have not been able to clean since." Celia put the cup down. The silence that followed was not comfortable, but it was the kind of silence that happens when something true has entered a room and is waiting to be recognized. "Randall Hanford," she said. "He wanted your father's land, not the Abilene property, the Colorado land. The land your father had been quietly buying parcels of for years, out here. Hanford has cattle interests in this region, and the water rights on your father's property are worth considerably more than your father ever realized. The spring on your land feeds into the Copper Ridge stream, which feeds into the main watershed for this entire valley. Hanford wanted it, and your father refused to sell." "So he had him destroyed," Celia said. "Yes." She looked out the window at the dusty main street of Dusthaven, at the ordinary morning commerce of a small frontier town, and she thought about her father sitting in the wreckage of his life in the months before he died, unable to understand why God had let it happen to him, unable to understand what he had done wrong. He had done nothing wrong. He had simply had something that a powerful man wanted. "And now you are here," she said. "I came to make it right, or as right as I can make something that cannot be entirely made right." He looked directly at her, and she noticed for the first time that there was something haunted in him that sat in a different place than guilt. It was older than the Abilene courthouse. "I have evidence." Hanford used an intermediary to convey his threats, a man named Deke Sully who has since grown a conscience of his own, probably because Hanford turned on him last year and left him without wages or reference in a town where everyone knew his face. Sully is prepared to make a sworn statement. A real one in front of a federal marshal, not a county court that Hanford has in his pocket. "And you think that changes what happened to my father?" Celia said. "No," Calvin said without hesitation. "I think it changes what happens to you." Hanford's agent arrived in Dusthaven 6 days ago, about 2 days before I did. I know because I have been watching Hanford's operations for the better part of a year. He knows you inherited the land and he wants to acquire it the same way he acquired everything else, through pressure and fabrication, and the particular kind of trap that looks like an accident until it is too late to get out of it. The word trap went through her like a current. "He sent someone here. Man named Fletcher. Big, quiet, works as a surveyor. His plan, as best I can reconstruct it, is to challenge the deed on a technicality. Your father purchased those parcels under slightly different versions of his name across several transactions, Harold A. Cooper and H. Cooper and Harold Cooper. A clever lawyer could argue they are different buyers, and that the consolidation of those parcels into a single deed was improperly executed." "That is absurd," Celia said. "It is also exactly the kind of thing that works in a county court where the judge owes Hanford a favor," Calvin said, "which is why I came here. Not just for the apology you deserve, though God knows you deserve it, but because I will not let him do to you what he did to your father. I will not stand by this time." Celia felt the anger in her begin to do something complicated. It did not go away. That was important, she noted. She was not foolish enough to let a well-told story dissolve 3 years of righteous feeling in a single conversation. But it shifted, changed shape, became less a fire aimed entirely at him and more a fire aimed in the same direction he was now facing. "You carved my name into that post," she said again, but differently this time. He met her eyes. "Because I needed this town to know, before Hanford's man could establish a false narrative, that I knew you, that you were expected, that your claim here was legitimate and witnessed. In a place like this, a name carved is a kind of testimony. People remember it, they talk about it. By the time you arrived, everyone in Dusthaven had asked each other who Celia Cooper was, which meant that when you rode in, you were not a stranger. You were already someone." She stared at him. It was the most unexpected thing he had said, and it was also, she realized slowly, an act of care so precisely calibrated that it made something in her chest do a thing she was not prepared for. "You are not what I expected," she said finally. "No," he agreed. "I don't imagine I am." She did not thank him that morning. She was not ready for that yet. But she rode back to her land with something different living in her. A small, complicated flame that was not anger and not trust, and not anything she had a good name for in October of 1878 in the foothills of Copper Ridge, Colorado. She began to see him every day after that, and not because she planned to. He was working the south parcel of his claim, which shared the fence line with her east gate, and the nature of the work meant that they were frequently within speaking distance of each other in the early mornings. He was building something, she gathered, a proper structure for a homestead claim, not a temporary camp. He worked with a quiet efficiency that she found herself watching without meaning to, the way you watch something that moves well. On the 4th morning she brought him coffee in a tin cup without announcing she was going to do it, and handed it to him over the gate, and he took it with both hands and said thank you in a voice that was slightly unsteady in a way that she chose not to examine too closely. They talked while he worked, and she mended the south fence of her own property, which needed attention. He had grown up in Missouri, he told her, the second of 4 children, father killed in the war when Calvin was 12. His mother had kept the family together through sheer will and very little money. He had drifted west at 19 looking for work and found it in a variety of forms, some of which he described and some of which he clearly did not. He had been in Kansas when Hanford's man found him. "Your sister," Celia said one morning about a week into these conversations. "She is safe." Something softened in his face. "She is. Married a good man in Wichita, 2 boys now." He paused. "She does not know what I did. About the testimony, I have not been able to tell her." "You will have to eventually," Celia said. "I know," he said, with a heaviness that told her he had known it for 3 years and was not one step closer to being ready. She was beginning, against every intention she had arrived with, to understand him. Not to excuse what he had done, she was not willing to do that yet, but to see the full shape of it, the dark past that had made him a tool in someone else's machinery, the self-recrimination that had apparently driven him 400 miles to try to repair a damage that he probably knew could not be fully repaired. The distinction between those 2 things, understanding and excusing, was the razor's edge she walked every morning at the fence line. The land helped her. It was good land, and she had not expected to love it the way she found herself loving it, the way the light hit the ridge in the late afternoon, the sound of the spring, the smell of pine and ironwood. Her father had chosen well. Whatever else Randall Hanford had taken from Harold Cooper, he had not taken this, and the knowledge of it sat in Celia's chest like something warm and permanent. She had a letter from Dusthaven's postmaster, forwarded from Abilene, from her friend Miriam in the 2nd week. Miriam wanted to know if she had arrived safely and whether the land was livable and whether she was lonely. She wrote back 3 pages, which was more than she had intended, and in the 3rd page she found herself describing Calvin Carson in terms that, on rereading before she sealed the envelope, caused her to sit very still for a moment, and then fold the letter and burn it and write a shorter one instead. The Fletcher problem materialized in the 3rd week of October. He arrived at her door on a Wednesday morning with a leather case and a manner that was smooth in the way that things are smooth when they have been deliberately polished to conceal the roughness underneath. He was perhaps 45, with the kind of face that had once been handsome and had since become merely competent. He represented, he said, a land acquisition firm in Denver that had an interest in the Copper Ridge watershed region, and he had some questions about the provenance of her deed. Celia let him stand on the step and did not invite him inside. "My deed is properly filed," she said. "Mr. Piercy at the land office can confirm it." "Of course," Fletcher said pleasantly. "The question isn't the filing, Miss Cooper. It's the chain of title. There appear to be several discrepancies in the purchase records going back some years, and the firm I represent has reason to believe that the consolidation of parcels may not be legally defensible under Colorado territorial law." "I see," Celia said. Her voice was very calm. "And who is this firm?" Fletcher produced a card. The firm had a Denver address and a name she did not recognize, but she was already fairly certain that somewhere behind the Denver address was Randall Hanford's money. "I'll need time to consult with my own attorney," she said. "Of course," Fletcher said again. "The firm is prepared to offer a fair purchase price for the property in lieu of a protracted legal challenge. I think you'll find it quite generous." She closed the door in his face, which gave her considerable satisfaction. She found Calvin at the fence line within the hour and told him what had happened. His expression did not change much, but his jaw did something that she recognized by now as controlled anger. "Faster than I expected," he said. "I've been writing to Deke Sully in Wichita for the past 2 weeks. He has committed to making a sworn statement, but it needs to be in front of a federal authority. There is a deputy federal marshal stationed in Denver, a man named Harkins. I know him. He is honest, which is a rarer quality in his profession than it should be." "How long to get Harkins here?" 2 weeks if we send a wire today and he moves promptly. A month if he doesn't." He paused. Can you hold Fletcher off for 2 weeks? I believe I can be spectacularly difficult for 2 weeks, Celia said, and he laughed, which was the first time she had heard him laugh, and it was a good sound, genuine and slightly surprised, as if he had forgotten laughing was something he did. They rode into Dusthaven together that afternoon to send the wire to Denver. It was the first time they had ridden side by side in public, and she noticed the looks, not unfriendly, mostly curious, the particular attention that a small frontier town devotes to the developing business of two people who are clearly becoming something. Hattie Drummond was sitting on her porch as they passed and called out, "You're a matched pair for stubbornness, I'll say that much." Celia did not respond, but she felt warmth climb her neck and was grateful that her hat brim was wide. The wire went out. They settled in to wait. In the meantime, Fletcher made 2 more visits. Celia fielded them both with the same composed, infuriating pleasantness, always consulting her attorney, always needing more time, always finding some new question that required investigation before she could possibly make a decision. She had never had formal legal training, but she had spent her childhood listening to her father discuss his affairs with exhaustive thoroughness, and she had an instinct for the pressure points in an argument. Calvin worked his claim. She worked her land. They fell into a rhythm that was domestic in its bones and electric in what lay beneath, the way a river looks calm from a distance but runs fast when you put your hand in it. He fixed her roof grate without being asked, arriving one morning with the new iron piece from Harlan's store in a toolbox, and when she came out of the house and found him on the ladder, she stood below and watched and felt the warmth she had been carefully not examining become something more specific and less avoidable. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "I know," he said from the roof. "I would have done it myself." "I know that too," he said, and looked down at her, and the look lasted a beat longer than necessary, which she noted and filed away in the place where she was storing all the things she was not yet ready to say. She told him about her father one evening when they were sitting on the stone step outside her door, watching the ridge go gold in the sunset. She told him about the man Harold Cooper had actually been, a farmer and reader of books who could quote Emerson from memory, and who had cried at the birth of every animal on their land, but pretended he had something in his eye. She told him about the way her father used to walk the fence line of his Kansas property every Sunday morning as a kind of prayer, and how she had started doing the same thing here, walking her fence line in the early morning, not because she was checking it, but because it felt like continuing something. Calvin listened without interrupting. He was very good at listening. It was one of the things she was accumulating about him, a list she had not intended to start and could not seem to stop adding to. When she was done, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "He sounds like a man who deserved a great deal better than what he got." "He did," she said. "He really did." A pause. "I am sorry, Celia." It was the first time he had used her given name, and it landed differently than she expected. Not with the hardness she might have anticipated from a man she had hated for 3 years. With something that felt almost like relief, as if a door had been opened that she had thought was locked from the other side. "I know you are," she said quietly. She did not say she forgave him. Not yet. But the space between them on the step was small, and the light was beautiful, and the thing she had been carrying alone for 3 years felt, for the first time, like something with room for two. 3 days later, something happened that shifted the stakes entirely. She came home from a supply run to find her east gate standing open, and the spring fouled with something, a thick, oily sediment that had not been there in the morning. She knelt by the water, smelled it, and felt cold certainty settle over her. This was deliberate. It would clear in time. Spring water has a way of healing, but the message of it was not subtle. She went to find Calvin. He was at the gate before she finished telling him what she had found, moving with a controlled urgency she had not yet seen in him, quick and decisive and entirely unreadable except for the line of his jaw. "Fletcher," she said. "Or one of his men," Calvin said. "This is escalation. He is done with the polite visits and the legal threats. He wants you scared enough to sell." "I am not scared," Celia said, which was mostly true and also not the point. "I know," he said. "But we need to move faster." He looked at her steadily. "I am going to ride to Pueblo tomorrow and send a second wire and a letter by express. If Harkins does not move on the first wire, a letter from Deke Sully enclosed should convince him. Sully has written it already. I have it in my saddlebag." "That is a 2-day ride to Pueblo," she said. "I know. You would leave your claim." "The claim can look after itself for 4 days," he said, and something in his certainty about that made her realize that whatever he was building on that south parcel, it was not the thing he was most committed to protecting. She met his eyes and held them. "Be careful." His expression changed in a way she was not sure she had words for. It was not surprise exactly. It was more like something he had not let himself hope for appearing. "I will," he said. He left before dawn. She watched the light come up over the ridge without him and felt the absence of him in a way that told her more about herself than she was entirely comfortable with. Fletcher came on the second day Calvin was gone. He did not come to the door this time. He sent a man, one of 2 that she had seen him with in town, to ride past her property 3 times in the late afternoon in a slow, deliberate circuit that was clearly meant to be noticed. It was a threat wearing the clothes of a coincidence, and she sat on her step and watched it with her rifle across her knees and her face perfectly still. She was not alone entirely. She had introduced herself to her nearest neighbor, a widow named Esperanza Vila who had a small ranch about a mile west and who had lived in this valley for 12 years and knew everything worth knowing about it. Esperanza was 50, formidable and possessed of a Spanish that she deployed in moments of strong feeling, and an English that she deployed when she needed people to understand her with precision. She had met Calvin already and formed a favorable opinion of him based primarily on the fact that he had helped dig her well cover back into place after a storm without being asked. "He is a man who sees what needs doing," Esperanza said, which Celia was beginning to suspect was exactly right. Esperanza rode over on the second evening when she saw the circuit rider passing and simply sat with Celia on the step until the rider gave up. And then they went inside and had supper together and talked about practical things. Esperanza had survived a range war in the late 1860s and had opinions about intimidation tactics that were clear-eyed and not particularly romantic. "They want you afraid," Esperanza said. "The moment you are afraid, they have something to work with. The moment you are not afraid, they have nothing." "I am not afraid," Celia said. "I am angry," Esperanza smiled. "Good. Anger is useful. Fear is not." Calvin returned on the 4th day, mid-morning, dusty and tired, and carrying a wire confirmation from Deputy Marshal Harkins saying he would arrive in Dusthaven within 10 days. He found Celia splitting wood behind the house, which she did not strictly need to do, but which had become her preferred method of managing strong feeling. He got off his horse and stood watching her for a moment, and she set the axe down and turned to look at him, and neither of them said anything for a beat that contained several things simultaneously. "Harkins is coming," he said. "I heard the news in town already," she said. "The wire came this morning." "Right," he paused. "The East Spring, is it clear?" "Clearing," she said. "Another day or 2, he nodded. He looked like he had slept badly and thought continuously for 4 days. And something about the evidence of that on his face made her take 3 steps toward him before she was conscious of deciding to move, and then she was close enough to see the tiredness in his eyes and the relieved quality of the way he was looking at her. "Thank you," she said, "for going." "You don't need to thank me," he said. "I know I don't need to," she said. "I want to." There was a long pause in which the morning air moved between them with considerable awareness of itself. "Celia," he said. "Don't," she said, not harshly, more like a gentle hand pressed flat against something. "Not yet. Let Harkins come first. Let this be finished first." He looked at her with an expression that held patience and something warmer underneath it, and he said, "All right." But that evening he stayed for supper without being invited, and she did not ask him to leave, and they sat at the small table in her stone house and ate the quail stew she had made and talked about everything except what was most present between them, which was its own kind of intimacy, the kind that comes from not needing to say a thing because it is already being understood. She told him about what she wanted to do with the land. More of it. She had been thinking about this during the days he was gone, about what her father had imagined when he bought these parcels, about what she might build here that would be a proper life rather than simply a defended position. She wanted to bring in sheep in the spring, perhaps. The land was good for it, and she wanted to plant the south field with winter wheat and see what it did. He listened with the particular quality of attention he had that was different from mere politeness, the kind that suggested he was actually constructing a picture, actually seeing what she described. The North Ridge would shelter the flock well, he said. Wind comes from the northwest in winter. If you built the fold against the ridge wall, it would be protected on two sides. She looked at him. You know sheep. My mother kept them in Missouri, he said. Not many, but enough that I remember the principles. She found herself smiling, which happened more often now when she was with him, and she had stopped being surprised by it. The next 10 days were the strangest of her life in a way she had not anticipated. On the surface they were all waiting, the waiting for Harkins, the watching of Fletcher, the careful management of paperwork and statements, and the steady work of the land. But underneath the surface, something was growing between her and Calvin Carson that moved at its own pace, independent of the legal situation, independent of what either of them had intended when they arrived in Dusthaven. He brought her a book from the general store, a Walter Scott novel that Harlan had acquired in a lot of Eastern goods and that Calvin had noticed her looking at twice. He left it on the gate post with no note, and she knew immediately who had left it and sat with the knowledge for a long time before she could make herself set it aside and go back to work. She started leaving the coffee on the fence post in the mornings instead of handing it to him directly, and he started leaving small things in return. A bundle of dried herbs from somewhere, a new leather strap for her saddlebag that he had oiled and stitched himself, once a single stone from the creek bed that was an unusual rust-red color, which she put on the windowsill of her bedroom without examining why. It was Esperanza who finally said it plainly, the way Esperanza said everything. You love him, she said one afternoon when she had come to help Celia take stock of the winter supplies. I do not, Celia said. Esperanza looked at her with the calm patience of a woman who has no interest in being argued with. You brought him coffee for 10 mornings in a row, she said. You light up when you hear his horse. You smile when you think no one is watching, and I am always watching because I am 50 years old and that is one of the pleasures available to me. She paused. I understand why you are afraid of it. He comes from a complicated place in your history, but he is here now, doing complicated good things. A person can be both the wound and the healer. Celia was quiet for a long time. My father liked him, you know, she said finally, before Abilene. He mentioned a Calvin Carson once, a young man he had briefly hired to help drive a small herd, said he was steady and honest. She paused. I had forgotten that until recently. Your father knew people, Esperanza said simply. Deputy Marshal Harkins arrived on a Tuesday in mid-November, which was earlier than the 10 days he had promised and for which Celia was grateful. He was a compact, gray-haired man of perhaps 55 who wore his authority quietly and inspected the evidence. Calvin laid before him with a methodical thoroughness that was reassuring precisely because it showed no emotion. Deke Sully's sworn statement, delivered in person because Sully had apparently decided to make the trip himself rather than trust paper to this degree of consequence, was detailed and specific. He named dates, amounts, the precise threats that had been conveyed to Calvin, the name of the lawyer Hanford had used to manufacture the title challenge, the judge who had been promised a favorable land arrangement in exchange for ruling against Harold Cooper. Harkins read it twice. He looked at Calvin. He looked at the statement again. This is a serious set of allegations, he said. Yes, Calvin said. they are also completely accurate. You understand that your own false testimony is part of this record. I do, Calvin said. I am prepared to own that fully under oath, in whatever jurisdiction you determine appropriate. Harkins looked at him for a long moment with the appraising quality of a man who has spent 30 years determining who is telling the truth. All right, he said. The matter of Fletcher was resolved with remarkable swiftness once the federal authority of Harkins was made explicit and the full picture was placed in front of the land agent. Fletcher was not, it turned out, a particularly loyal foot soldier. When Harkins made clear that the Denver acquisition firm's connection to Hanford was fully documented and that criminal charges were possible, Fletcher produced a written account of his instructions within the hour and was on the next eastbound stage out of Dusthaven before dark. The title challenge evaporated. The deed was confirmed clean and full. Celia stood in Piercy's land office with the confirmed document in her hands and felt something she had not felt in 3 years, the particular solidity of a ground that is not going to move. The matter of Hanford himself would take longer. Federal processes always did, and Harkins was honest about that. But the evidence was sufficient to open a formal investigation, and Harkins had what he needed to ensure that Hanford's influence in the local courts was scrutinized and curtailed. It would not be quick, but it would happen. On the evening after Harkins left for Denver with his documents and his witness, Celia walked to the fence line and stood at the gate in the fading light, and Calvin was there on the other side of it, which she had somehow known he would be. The gate was between them, but it was open. She looked at him and he looked at her, and the full weight of everything that had happened, the 3 years of grief, the carved name on the post, the dark past that had driven him here, the strange and complicated thing that had grown between them across that fence line in 6 weeks of Colorado autumn, all of it was present in the air between them. "I have been thinking," she said, "about what you said the first day we spoke, about carving my name so this town would know I was expected. So I would not be a stranger. I remember," he said. "That was not just strategy," she said. "Was it? A beat?" "No," he said, "it wasn't." "When did you know?" she asked. "Before you even came here, you must have known something about me beyond the facts of the land dispute." He was quiet for a moment in the way he got quiet when he was about to be completely honest about something. "I have been carrying the weight of what I did to your family for 3 years," he said. "In that time, I learned a great deal about Harold Cooper, trying to understand what I had been part of. I learned about his daughter. The things people said about her, the postmaster in Abilene, the woman who ran the boarding house there, they all said the same thing. Fierce, fair, smarter than most men she met and uninterested in pretending otherwise." He paused. "By the time I decided to come here, I think I was already more than simply obligated. I think I was already hoping." The admission sat in the evening air. "You are a complicated man," she said. "Yes," he agreed. "I am." She opened the gate and stepped through it onto his side of the fence line and looked up at him in the last of the light. "I am not finished being angry at you," she said honestly. "Some of it is going to be there for a long time." "I know," he said. "And I am not willing to pretend the past was something other than what it was. I wouldn't ask you to. But," she said and paused, and felt the truth of it settle into her like the first warmth after a long cold. "I think I have been in love with you since the moment you told me you were afraid of your sister being hurt. Because that is the kind of thing a person says when they are actually in the room with you, when they are not performing. And you have been actually in the room with me since the day we met, which is more than I can say for most people." Calvin Carson stood very still in the way he did when something had reached him deeply, the stillness of a man containing something large. Then he reached out and took her hand. Just that, her hand in his, the calluses and the scars and the warmth of him. "I carved your name," he said, "because I needed there to be proof, somewhere in the world, that you were real and that I was coming, and that what I owed you was not small." He paused. "I did not know that it would become the best thing I ever did." She leaned up and kissed him, and he kissed her back with the gentle, careful quality of a man who intends to last, who is not in a hurry because he is planning to be present for a very long time, and the ridge above them caught the last copper light of the November evening and held it. Winter came to Copper Ridge with a seriousness that Celia had been warned about, and that she was still not entirely prepared for. The snow arrived in December and was not playful or decorative. It was determined, heavy and total, lying 3 feet deep by Christmas and showing no interest in leaving. She had the stone house, which was warm. She had firewood that she and Calvin had spent October and November accumulating in quantities that now seemed, in the middle of actual winter, to have been entirely reasonable. She had the sheep she had decided not to wait until spring for, 6 of them, acquired from a farmer east of Pueblo in late October, and they were in the small barn attached to the house, warm and complaining. And she had Calvin, who had not gone back to his claim camp after the first serious snowfall, not because she had invited him formally, and not because anything had been formally declared, but because the distance between their properties was too far to manage in heavy snow, and because neither of them had found a way to be practical about the thing that was happening between them that required the kind of deliberate inefficiency of staying apart. He slept in the barn loft initially, which was his own suggestion, and which she allowed for approximately 3 weeks before she told him plainly that it was absurd, and that the stone house had 2 rooms, and that the second room was currently being used to store winter supplies that could be moved. "I am not suggesting anything improper," she said, in a tone that had all the marks of a woman being very precise. "I am suggesting that the barn is cold, and that the second room has a floor, and that neither of us needs to pretend the other is not a person who lives here." He moved into the second room, which was about 12 feet from her room, and the 12 feet was simultaneously entirely respectable and entirely insufficient for what either of them was managing to contain by late December of 1878. They spent the evenings reading and talking and playing cards at the small table, and they had arguments, real ones, about things that mattered and things that did not, which she found she loved because it meant neither of them was performing anything. He had opinions about cattle management that she found misguided and said so. She had opinions about risk that he found too conservative and said so with the calm certainty that she was learning was his characteristic mode. They argued about the Walter Scott novel. They argued about the right way to mend a section of fence. They agreed on most of the things that were actually important. On New Year's Eve of 1878, which fell on a Monday that was so cold the inside of the windows frosted over, she was sitting close to the fire reading, and he was at the table writing a letter to his sister, the letter he had told her months ago he could not quite manage to write. He set the pen down after a long time and looked at her. "I told her," he said, "in the letter. About the testimony, about what actually happened." Celia looked up from her book. "All of it," she said. "All of it," he said. "And about you, about coming here, about what I found here." She held his gaze. "What did you write about what you found here?" He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "That I arrived owing a debt I could not repay, and that I found something I had not known I was looking for." She put the book down. She crossed the room, which was 6 steps, and sat in the chair beside him and put her hand over his where it rested on the table. "Calvin." "Yes," he said. "I think we should be married," she said. "In the spring when the circuit preacher comes through. I think we should do it properly, and I think we should both stop pretending we are managing a practical arrangement." His hand turned under hers and held it. "I was going to ask you," he said. "I know," she said. "I am faster." He laughed, that good surprised laugh that she had loved since the first time she heard it, and then he pulled her toward him and kissed her thoroughly, and outside the snow fell straight and heavy in the windless cold of the last night of 1878. The letter to his sister brought a reply in February that made Calvin sit at the table for a long time without moving. Celia let him be for a while, and then she sat across from him and waited. "She forgives me," he said. She says she has always known something was wrong about that year, and that she is relieved to know the truth even though it is hard. He paused. She says she would like to come and meet you when the weather allows. Good, Celia said. I would like to meet her. He looked across the table at her with an expression she had learned to read over the winter months, the one that contained things he had not yet found words for. You have given me back something I did not think I would recover, he said. You gave it back yourself, she said. I was just here. Celia, he said, being here is not a small thing, you know that. She did know that. She had not thought she would ever know the peace of being here with someone, the particular peace of a winter evening and a fire, and a person across the table who knew the full truth of you and was still present. She had thought grief would be her permanent companion, that the year her father died had sealed something in her that would not open again. I know, she said quietly. Spring came in March and arrived in the way spring arrives in Colorado, tentatively and then all at once, the snow pulling back from the ridges to reveal the brown grass that would be green by April, the creek running high and loud with melt, the sheep stepping out of the barn into a world that had become larger while they were not watching. The circuit preacher came through Dusthaven in the second week of April, which was a reverend named Elias Moss who was 70 years old and had married people in every condition and circumstance of the frontier life, and who was, Hattie Drummond reported approvingly, entirely unshockable. Celia wore the dress she had made over the winter, a deep blue wool that she had ordered the fabric for from the Eastern catalog in January with a specific occasion in mind. Calvin wore the coat he had sent for, dark, well-fitted, and clearly chosen with care. Esperanza Vila stood beside Celia as witness. The only other attendees were Hattie, Piercy from the land office, and Ada from the Blue Star Kitchen, who brought a cake that was genuinely impressive and created no small amount of talk in Dusthaven for the following week. They said their vows in Dusthaven's small church, which had a pine floor and 6 pews, and a window that caught the April morning light at an angle that made everything look like it was lit from inside. Reverend Moss read from Scripture, and then said some words of his own that were so precisely right for the two of them, and the complicated road that had brought them to this moment that Celia found herself wondering if Mrs. Yarrow had briefed him. When Calvin put the ring on her finger, a simple gold band he had bought in Pueblo in late February and worn in his pocket for 6 weeks, his hands were steady but his eyes were not, and she looked at him and felt the full force of what it means to be chosen by someone who knows exactly what they are choosing. I do, she said, with a clarity and a certainty that left no room for anything except itself. They rode home to the stone house together in the spring afternoon, and the ridge above them was full of pine and new light, and the east gate stood open between their two properties as it had stood through the winter, because they had simply stopped closing it. In June, Calvin's sister Emily arrived with her husband Thomas and their 2 boys, ages 3 and 5, in a wagon from Wichita that took 3 weeks to make the journey. Emily was 21, dark-haired like Calvin, with a directness that Celia recognized and liked immediately. She had clearly spent the journey preparing to feel something complicated about Celia, and within about 4 hours of arriving, all of the complication had sorted itself into something much simpler. He is genuinely happy, Emily said to Celia on the second morning, sitting at the kitchen table with coffee while the men and boys were out looking at the sheep. I have not seen him genuinely happy in a very long time. She paused, possibly ever. He makes it easy, Celia said, when he is not being infuriatingly certain about things. Emily laughed. That is an extremely accurate description of my brother. The visit lasted 2 weeks. On the last night, Emily told Calvin privately that she forgave him, not by letter this time but in person, with her hands on his face in the way of a sister who has had a brother through everything and is not letting go of that. Celia was not there for that conversation, but she could see, in the quality of Calvin's face when he came inside afterward, that something had shifted in him, some weight that had been set down at last in a place where it would stay. In July, A letter arrived from Wichita with news that Randall Hanford had been formally charged by federal indictment on 3 counts related to fraudulent land acquisition and the corruption of a county court official. Deputy Marshal Harkins had written personally to Calvin with the details, and his letter included the information that the judge who had ruled against Harold Cooper had resigned his position as part of a settlement agreement, and that the case would likely be cited in the formal rehabilitation of Harold Cooper's record. It was not resurrection. Harold Cooper was still dead, and no legal proceeding was going to change that. But it was something. It was his name cleared. It was the truth of him, put back into the public record where it belonged. Celia sat with the letter for a long time that evening on the stone step where she and Calvin had sat so many times that the step had become a place with its own gravity. He sat beside her with his arm around her, and she leaned into him with the full weight of what she was feeling, which was grief and relief and gratitude and love in proportions she could not quite separate. He would have been glad, she said finally. Yes, Calvin said, he would. The autumn of 1879 brought the sheep project into its first real success. She had 18 of them by October, the original 6 having produced 12 lambs in spring, of whom 8 had survived to become proper flock members. She had traded 2 lambs in Dusthaven for a spinning wheel, which she was learning from Esperanza, and the wool from the fall shearing filled 3 large bins in the barn. Calvin had built a proper structure on his claim over the summer, a real house with 4 rooms and a covered porch, using the good pine from the North Ridge and the stone from the creek bed. He had built it with a particular attention to the window placement that she noticed and understood, every main window looking either toward the ridge or toward her property, nothing turned away from what mattered. They were in both houses as the mood moved them, which was not a complicated system. Where the work was where they were. Where the evening was where they ended up together. She discovered she was expecting their first child in November of 1879, which she told him on the stone step in the early morning before he had fully had his coffee, because she found she could not wait for a better moment. He went very still in the way she had learned meant the arrival of something enormous. Then he set his coffee cup down on the step and put both arms around her and held her in the morning cold with his chin on the top of her head, and she felt the tremor in him that was joy expressing itself through a body that was not quite prepared for it. "A child," he said, as if he was trying out the word to see if it was real. "Yes," she said. "Ours." He pulled back enough to look at her face. His eyes were bright. "Are you well?" "I am very well," she said. "I am also going to need someone to lift the heavier supply orders for a while." He laughed, and she kissed him, and the morning light came over the ridge and fell across the stone house and the open gate, and the fence line where a name was still carved into the old post, a little more weathered now than it had been 2 years ago, but unmistakably clear. In the spring of 1880, Celia Cooper Carson gave birth to a boy in the stone house, delivered by Mrs. Yarrow, who had a practical midwifery competence she had never bothered to advertise. He was a healthy child with dark hair and a particular stubborn quality in his expression from the first days of his life that made Esperanza laugh and say he had his mother in him already. They named him Harold Calvin Carson. Calvin held him in the lamplight of the first evening and looked at him with the expression of a man who has arrived, finally and completely, in a life that is his. And Celia lay in the bed and watched them, and felt the full, warm weight of everything she had built here settle around her like something permanent and true. Hattie Drummond came to see the baby the following week, and reported back to every person in Dusthaven with an efficiency that meant the entire town knew Harold Carson's weight, hair color, and particular temperament before the end of the day. Ada brought food. Esperanza brought a blanket she had woven from Celia's own wool, dark blue and cream, which Harold was immediately wrapped in and refused, by general consensus, to be unwrapped from for several days. The letter Calvin's sister Emily sent in response to the birth announcement was 4 pages long and contained so much warmth that Celia read it twice, and then folded it carefully and put it in the small cedar box where she kept things that mattered. Harold grew the way good things grow, steadily, and with increasing confidence. By the time he was pulling himself upright against the furniture, he had established a set of opinions about the world that were clear and largely non-negotiable, which Celia found thoroughly delightful, and Calvin found himself navigating with the patient, certain quality that was his characteristic approach to things he cared about. In the autumn of 1881, when Harold was a year and a half old and had recently achieved the project of walking with more determination than coordination, Celia found herself expecting again. This second pregnancy she told Calvin in the evening at the kitchen table, which was the proper moment, unhurried, with the lamp lit and the fire going and Harold already asleep in the second room. Calvin reached across the table and took her hand. "Good," he said simply, and the simplicity of it contained everything. The second child, born in the summer of 1882, was a girl. They named her Anna, after Calvin's mother, and she arrived with the vigorous announcement of someone who intended to make her presence known and never really stopped. Harold examined her with the solemn authority of a 2-year-old who had opinions about change, and then accepted her with the pragmatic good nature that was becoming his defining characteristic. In the years that followed, Dusthaven grew the way small frontier towns grow, slowly at first, and then with increasing momentum as the railroad extended its reach into the region. New families arrived. A school was built in 1883, which Celia was involved in organizing, and which she pressed the town council to fund properly, a campaign that took 2 years and a degree of stubborn persistence that was, Hattie Drummond said, entirely characteristic of Celia Carson. She had kept the Cooper in her identity in the way she felt her father deserved. She was Celia Cooper Carson in all formal matters and in her own sense of herself, both the woman who had ridden into Dusthaven with nothing but a deed and a grief, and the woman she had become here. Calvin continued to work the land. He had consolidated his claim properly, and the south parcel and her land were operated together now as a single enterprise, formal boundary lines still existing but practically irrelevant, a fence with a gate that was simply always open. The sheep flock had grown to 60. The winter wheat was reliable. He had added 3 horses to the operation and a proper smokehouse built against the north wall of the stone house. Deke Sully's testimony had held through the federal proceedings, and in 1882, Randall Hanford was convicted on 2 of the 3 charges and fined a sum that significantly curtailed his operations in Colorado. He did not go to prison, which was a reality of how such things worked, and which Celia acknowledged with a measured frustration rather than a consuming bitterness. The important things had been accomplished. The land was safe. Her father's name was clear. The systems that Hanford had corrupted were under scrutiny that would outlast any single prosecution. She had one more thing to do that she had been waiting for. In the autumn of 1883, she rode up to the Ridge Post. It was a Saturday morning, bright and cold, with Harold, age 3½ perched in front of her on the saddle, and Anna in a carrier on Calvin's chest, who rode beside her. The post was there as it had always been, the name carved in the pine, weathered now to a silver gray that made the letters look more permanent rather than less. She got down from the horse with Harold, who stood in the frost-stiffened grass, and looked at the post with the serious attention he gave to most things. "Mama's name," he said, reading the letters with the early confidence of a child who had been read to since birth. "Yes," she said. "Who put it there?" "Your father did," she said, "before I arrived, before he even knew me. He put it there because he wanted people to know I was coming." Harold looked from the post to Calvin, who had dismounted and was standing with Anna against his chest and his free hand in his coat pocket and the morning light on his face. "Why?" Harold said, with the perfectly direct simplicity of a child who has not yet learned not to ask the most important questions. Calvin looked at Celia across the silver morning air. "Because," he said, "she mattered." And when someone matters that much, you find a way to say it, even before you know exactly how to say it. Harold considered this with great seriousness. "Oh," he said, and appeared satisfied, the way children are satisfied when they receive an answer that is actually true. Celia stood between the two of them, her son and her husband, with the post at her back and the ridge above her, and the valley below full of everything she had built and survived and chosen. And she thought about the woman who had ridden into this town 3 years before with nothing but anger and grief, and a deed to land she had never seen. Nobody had warned that woman that the drifter had carved her name into the ridge post before saying hello. Nobody had warned her what it would mean, that the act of carving it was itself a kind of love letter written in wood, a declaration made before all the reasons for it could be articulated, a man's best effort to say, from across 400 miles and 3 years of bad conscience, "You matter, and I am coming, and I will not let you be undefended in this place." She had come here expecting land and solitude. She had found both, and she had also found the particular kind of love that comes from being known by someone who has seen the worst of a situation and chosen to step into it anyway, not because it was easy but because it was right, and not because it was asked for but because it was necessary. She took Calvin's free hand, the one not holding their daughter. He looked at her, and in his eyes was everything she had learned to read there over 3 years of mornings and arguments and coffee at the fence post and books and sheep and difficult letters and 2 children and 1 carved name in old pine. "Ready to go home," he said. "Yes," she said. "Let's go home." They turned down from the ridge in the morning light, the 4 of them, and the valley opened below them in all its ordinary, extraordinary beauty, and the post stood behind them on the ridge with her name in it, as it would stand for many years more, until the pine softened and the wood gave back to the earth, which is what all things eventually do. But that was a long time from now. Now there was the ride down, and Harold's commentary on the horses and the trees and a crow he had spotted, and Anna making the small, satisfied sounds of a child held securely, and the smoke rising from the stone house chimney where Celia had banked the fire before leaving. Now there was the open gate waiting at the bottom of the ridge, and the spring running clear, and the sheep in the field moving in the slow, purposeful way of animals who know they are in the right place, and the winter wheat in the south field showing the pale gold of a good harvest waiting. Now there was the table in the stone house where the lamp would be lit in the evening, and the children would be fed, and a book would be read, and 2 people who had come to this place, by a long and difficult route, would sit across from each other in the ordinary miracle of a life they had built by hand. Celia Cooper Carson rode through the open gate and into her life, and it was good, and it was hers, and it was everything.